everybody, you may remember me. I'm Katie Correa and I'm a marine scientist with the Central Caribbean Marine Institute. I've been your underwater educator for the past 2 Reefs Go Live, and I'm actually underwater right now when you're watching this, getting ready for our 3rd Reefs Go Live on how do scientists grow coral. What we're doing now is basically we wanted to give you students a recap of what we had in a previous lesson so that you can try to apply it to today's lesson on how do scientists grow coral. So if you guys remember, a couple of weeks ago we had a Reefs Go Live on underwater symbiosis. And basically what that means is symbiosis is the relationship between 2 organisms, whether they both benefit from one another, one benefits and one is unaffected, or one is benefited and one is actually negatively affected. So, some examples of underwater symbiosis that we saw last week were, first of all, mutualism between a stony coral and its zooxanthellae that live inside the coral, because the zooxanthellae give that coral 95% of its nutrients, and then the coral gives the zooxanthellae a place to live. The second kind of symbiosis that we had underwater was commensalism, and we saw that example between a southern stingray and a barjack. This relationship was commensalism because the barjack gets to pick off tiny bits of food that the stingray doesn't eat, and the stingray doesn't really care that the barjack is kind of following right behind it. Now, the third type of symbiotic relationship is called parasitism, and we observed this between an isopod and a soldier fish. Now, this is when that isopod latches onto that soldier fish and actually sucks out its blood, potentially even eating its tongue and becoming the fish's tongue. This is obviously not very beneficial to that soldier fish and actually harms it in the process. So, those are the 3 kinds of underwater symbiosis that we saw last week. We also discussed with you guys how there are symbiotic relationships all around you, and encourage you to think about those different kinds of relationships that you see in your everyday life at home, at school, and maybe when you're walking to and from around town. So right now we're actually getting ready underwater to give this lesson, so we'll see you in a few minutes. Bye.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Reefs Go Live. My name is Ashley. I am a marine scientist here at the Central Caribbean Marine Institute, or CCMI. Today, I will be your host, as well as our underwater educator, Katie, and the rest of our team to take you on a dive to explore one of CCMI's coral nurseries. But before we do that, let's review again how this works. As a team, we're going to take you on a dive for some for some learning objectives to follow along as we go. So we want you to be able to see, hear, and interact with us live on this broadcast coming to you from Little Cayman. You have an activity class, you have a sheet that you have with you in class that we want you to make sure you're paying attention to and follow along so that you can complete that worksheet. And the way to interact with us during that is you have a chat box that you can see right on your screen, so just type in your question and we will see it. I'll do my best to relay it to Katie and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Ask as many questions as you want or as few. So a few things before we get to that. We also want to let you know that today we are broadcasting also on our Facebook page. So if you follow us on Facebook, welcome. We're happy to have you here for this dive. Please do save some of your questions, however, for the students. This is targeted for our local Caymanian students in years 5 and 6. So if you have questions, save them to the end so that we can ensure we get our students' questions into us. All right, for you students out there, there's some questions I'm going to ask you now, and I want you to think about it as this lesson goes on. If you know the answer, go ahead and type it into that chat box. Some of those questions are, what is a coral? What is a coral nursery? Why do we want to grow corals in a nursery? Why should only scientists or those trained by scientists help grow coral? And last but not least, how can I help in a local coral nursery on any one of the 3 Cayman Islands? All right, without further ado, I'm going to check in with our team underwater and see if we are good to go. Hey, Katie, how's it going down there?
Hey, Ashley. It looks like
Our team is everybody's in place and we're ready to go ahead and get started with the lesson whenever you are.
Sounds good. We're all set up here, so take it away, Katie.
All right, well, hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Reefs Go Live. Again, I'm your underwater educator, Katie, and I'm happy to have you guys as my dive buddies once again so that we can learn how do scientists grow coral. So, come with me and we'll go ahead and get started on the lesson.
Sounds like it's going to be another great dive, Katie. For today's lesson, can we begin with what kind of coral is CCMI growing and why?
Absolutely, a great place to start. We're just going to swim over here on the reef to one of our nursery structures that we have here so that you students can see what we're talking about. Now behind me we have another reefscape of little caiman, and the coral that we're choosing to grow in our CCMI coral nursery is right here in front of me. These are called staghorn coral. Let me just put my bag of tools down right here. As you can see, we only have one type of coral growing in this nursery, and it's this one, called staghorn coral, as I said, or Acropora cervicornis. Now, this coral gets its name because, as you can see, it's got these long branches, a little bit thick. It looks kind of like a stag's horn or a deer horn. It's also quite orange or brownish and kind of robust looking. And this is a coral that we choose to grow in our nursery for a variety of reasons. But if you students remember back to our first ever lesson on complex coral reefs, we talked about this species of coral being very important to coral reefs around Little Cayman and Caribbean wide. One reason that we chose to grow this particular species of coral is because it used to be prevalent on all of the reef around me, and now you really don't see very much of it anymore. This coral, just like all the other stony corals, if you remember, has a mutualistic symbiotic relationship with the teeny tiny little microscopic zooxanthellae that live inside. Now, if you remember back to our underwater symbiosis lesson that we had a few weeks ago, the zooxanthellae are the microscopic algae living inside of those coral polyps, which give this coral that really beautiful color and also give that coral about 95% of its nutrients. So if you remember, a mutualistic relationship is where one organism benefits and so does the other. So together they live in a symbiotic relationship together.
That's a lot of really great information on the staghorn coral, but why do we choose this type of coral over others?
Oh, it's a good question, Ashley. We choose to grow this species of coral in our coral nursery for a variety of reasons. Now, this is a relatively small nursery structure. We've actually moved it from our deeper coral nursery, which is a little bit farther away, here into shallower water, just for our Reefs Go Live today, because most of these structures are now in about 60 feet of water, which is just not as feasible and easy to host you guys for our Reefs Go Live. So we brought just one structure here full of these corals so that we could show you what it looks like. Now, again, why do we grow this species or this kind of coral? Well, for a number of reasons. This coral is critically endangered. In the 1970s and before, it was one of the most common kinds of coral you saw on all the reef around me. And then in the 1970s to the 2000s, there was a massive die-off, a big disease event all throughout the Caribbean Sea, which killed off about 90% of this species. Now, As you can see, staghorn coral, it's got a lot of branches. So when they get bigger, as you can see some of these down on the bottom, they start to get really complex and they intermix with each other and create this really complex framework that is very important to nursery habitats for juvenile, commercially important fish like groupers or snappers, and then of course all of the charismatic megafauna that we like, you know, eels and occasionally even juvenile nurse sharks. So there's a lot of reasons that we chose this particular coral over another.
Okay, that does make sense. I just want to take this minute to remind students that if you have any questions, type them into that chat box and we will see them and be able to ask Katie live here from Little Cayman. So Katie, you did review with us why we chose staghorn coral, but could you actually talk a little bit about growing this coral in a nursery setting? Is it at all close to growing or having plants in a garden at home?
Absolutely. It is very similar to growing plants in your garden at home. If any of you students joining us have an herb garden or a flower garden, growing a coral is not much different. So let's do the first step, which is making sure that we are cleaning the coral properly. So you'll just look down here. I have a bag of nursery supplies and tools. And I'll just go in here and get out a couple of things for you guys. Now these are very high-tech scientific tools that we use in our nursery. First, we've got what looks like a toothbrush. However, you don't want to brush your teeth with this toothbrush. If you look really closely, it's got metal bristles on it, and those metal bristles help to get rid of the algae growing on the coral. Now, if you remember back to our Complex World of Coral Reefs class, we talked about competition on the reef. We talked about good algae, like the algae that's living symbiotically inside this coral. And then we talked about the bad algae, which is the algae that's growing around the coral reef, directly competing with those corals. So what we want to do in our nursery is get rid of the weeds, or the bad algae, just like you students at home would get rid of the weeds in your garden. So we can either take our toothbrush, or we can take one of these, which is an exfoliating glove that they sell in pharmacies for scrubbing yourself in the shower. However, we also use it to scrub our corals clean. So, just as you would in your garden, let's de-weed this coral nursery. So you just simply clean this monofilament line that we have the coral hanging on. And for any fishermen or fisherwomen in our audience, this is some pretty heavy test fishing line, maybe 400 or 500 pound test you'd use for really large fish like tuna. And we use it to hang our corals from on the nursery because it's very strong. It's not easily breakable. It can withstand a lot of storm damage. And that's pretty much it. Now, the metal sleeves grow a different kind of algae, so you can actually scrub the metal sleeves with this metal toothbrush to get that algae off. And if there's any small bits of remaining algae, you can just kind of gently pick them off. Now, you want to try to maintain as least amount of contact with the coral as possible while you're doing this, because remember, this is a live animal. And there you go. That's a pretty clean little nursery area for that coral.
Katie, we have one question coming in from Lizette. She wants to know, when did we start to grow corals? When did we start growing corals?
That's a good question. Well, this coral nursery is pretty young. CCMI has only been growing corals here since 2012, so our coral nurseries are about 6 years old, but coral nurseries have been used as a well-accepted method for reef restoration as a tool for almost 20 years now.
We also have another question that I'd love to get you to answer right now. It's from a student in year 5, and they want to know, how often do we have to clean the corals?
That's a great question. So, how often do we need to clean the corals? Well, our scientists come out here about once a month to clean this coral nursery because, as you can see, Drew on our macro camera, there's like a lot of very filamentous or skinny, very kind of fluffy looking algae that grows on the monofilament line. And there's also an encrusting algae that grows on some of the PVC structure as well. Now, some of this algae can actually be beneficial for coral growth, but most of this filamentous algae is bad for it. And it grows pretty quickly. So we need to come out here and clean that about once a month.
That's great. Thank you for those questions, everybody. I also didn't realize how similar it was to growing plants on land as it was to grow corals underwater. So one of the next things that I'd love for you to demonstrate for us, Katie, is now that you've showed us the methods of growing corals underwater, is it possible that you could actually tell us what the next step is before you put these corals out onto the reef?
Absolutely. So, basically, the whole timeline of growing corals is we go out to the reef, we find a healthy natural colony of staghorn coral, we monitor it for about a year. We're looking for things like disease, bleaching, predation, because believe it or not, there are animals that eat corals, like fireworms and snails and damselfish as well. And actually, we've got a snail on this coral here. If Drew can come in and see that, there is a little tiny snail that's attached itself to this coral colony and is actually eating the tissue off of that coral. So, this is a real predator that eats coral, and if I were to pluck this off, you would see that there is a area of empty tissue left behind, and this is the snail that was eating it. So, we need to monitor for things like that. So after we find this natural colony of coral out on the reef, we need to monitor it, as I said, for about 1 year. After 1 year, if we determine that that coral doesn't have any signs of bleaching or disease or predation like we just saw, then we can go ahead and assume that it is 100% healthy. We'll take some clippings from it, just like you might take some clippings in your garden at home to make new plants, and we'll bring them into our nursery like you can see here. Now these have been here for a while, so they've grown out quite a bit. And once they've grown to a certain size, we either decide to take clippings again and rehang smaller pieces into the nursery, or we'll choose to outplant them directly onto the reef. But before we want to outplant them, we want to see exactly how big they are when we put them on the reef so that we can continue to monitor them over time. So this is actually perfect. You students back in class have a in-class activity sheet that I'd like for you guys to go ahead and take out now so that you can work with me in measuring some of these corals. So I have got a data sheet here, and I do believe that you you students have your in-class activity sheet, and you also have a ruler at the bottom of your sheet, just like I have. Now what we're going to do is on your activity sheet, I'm going to teach you how we measure branching corals just like this. So if you're ready, we'll go ahead and get started. The unit of measure that we use for these corals is called total linear extension, or TLE. And what that is the measurement of each branch in centimeters added up all together. So first, we'll start with the main branch of this coral here. So from tip to tip on one branch, I've got about 14 centimeters. So you want to make sure to write that on your data sheet. And then the next branch, from the base of it to the tip, is about 15 centimeters. And then the next branch is about 15 plus 3, so about 18 centimeters. And then this branch here is about 8 centimeters. So you students in class have a coral on your worksheet, and you can use that little ruler to measure the length of each of those branches, and just take a note on the side, just like I am, and continue to add those up. So we did the main branch, the second, third, and fourth. We'll do the fifth one. It's about 15 centimeters. And then the last two branches are smaller. We've got about 5. And let's see here. And 3. Okay. I think you guys had an easier coral to measure than I did. Maybe a little bit smaller. Mine are kind of large, so go ahead and add up all of those lengths of each branch and see what you students get all together. So that's 7, that's 12, that's 27, that's 38, 59, and 27, 70, so 83. So this coral here, I just added up all those branches. It's going to be a different size than the coral that you guys have on your activity sheet. And I got about 83 centimeters of total linear extension all together in that coral after I added all of those branches up. Alright, so that's pretty much the first step after you've cleaned the corals and you measure them before you go ahead and start outplanting each colony.
Katie, thank you so much for showing us that. It would seem that if humans had a total linear extension, we would have to measure all of our arms and legs as well. I hope all the students out there followed along with Katie and measured the coral that was on your in-class activity sheet. If not, that's okay. There's still time throughout the rest of the lesson that you can do that. Katie, we haven't checked in a while. How are you doing on air?
Oh, that's a great idea, Ashley. I have about 2,000 PSI, so we've still got plenty of time for the lesson.
Okay, great. There are some questions that's coming in from students, and Kimberly in grade 5 had a great one. She asked, is it not dangerous to clean and disturb the corals?
Oh, who asked that question?
That was Kimberly.
Wow, Kimberly, that is an excellent question. And honestly, you're right for a lot of reasons. So, these corals are a very delicate animal, as we've talked about previously in a couple lessons. Now, for those of you students who are fishermen, not only may you recognize this fishing line, but also If you've ever taken a fish off the hook, it feels very slimy. You're left behind with like this layer of mucus or slime on your hands, and it doesn't seem to go away. Well, corals have that same mucus layer on them. It's a protection against diseases or parasites and things like that. So when you look at a coral, sometimes you can actually see there's some mucus coming off of it. Now that mucus is a totally natural protector for that coral. And while we are cleaning the coral, you do want to be very careful to touch the coral as minimally as possible. Because if you do accidentally touch it, you'll take off some of that slimy mucus layer, and then it'll leave that coral open to diseases and parasites and things like that. So while I'm cleaning it, I do want to try to not touch the coral as often as possible. But at the end of the day, we are taking care of the coral by preventing it from having these predators, like how you saw me pick off that snail from that one coral that was eating it. Or if there was a ton of algae that had floated through the nursery, I would be able to actually pick that algae off of this coral, or the bad algae, off of this coral so that it didn't compete with that coral directly any longer. So I definitely don't want to touch it very often, as little as possible while I'm cleaning it, really. That's an awesome question, Kimberly.
That was a great question. Thank you for that one. I also want to point out we have another question from Shania at Primary East. She brought up the question, how do you plant a coral? And I think, Katie, you actually have a demonstration for that.
I definitely do, and it's a perfect follow-up question. So why don't you students come with me? Some of our safety divers have actually set up a special area right next to this coral nursery just so that you students can see what outplanting a coral is really like. So I'm just going to grab my bag of tools here and we can get started. Alright, so before we can outplant the coral, you students saw how we cleaned the corals, we measured them for total linear extension. We also want to make sure to pick corals that look 100% healthy, and then we know what their genetic history is or what their family is like. So on a lot of these corals you may notice they have a bead that's a different color. This coral has a black bead, this coral has a yellow bead, and this coral has a green bead. Each of these beads signifies a different family that coral came from. So that's something that we want to make sure to record before we outplant. Now I've got two corals here that were ready for outplanting. Let's see, I believe it's these two here. Yep. Alright, so these are the two corals that we're going to outplant today, and as you can see, they don't have a bead. These are corals that we found in our nursery as broken fragments, just kind of rolling around on the ground, and we don't know what family they came from. So we call them unknown genotypes, or they're from unknown family. So they have no bead associated with them. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to use these wire cutters to cut the coral as close as possible at the base, trying to leave as much of that monofilament line behind as possible. There we go. While our videographer Drew is getting things set up in the outplant area. then get my bag of tools here and you guys are gonna get to see Drew here, one of our videographers, getting set up in the outplanting area. All right. Now again, I will say that thanks to some of our support divers, Joe, and our videographer, Drew, for coming down here earlier in the dive to get to show you guys what outplanting is, and they prepped this area for us. So they went ahead and they chose this spot and they hammered the nails in and then they marked them with flagging tape so that I could find them very easily. So first thing we're going to do is just remove this flagging tape because we no longer need it. Making sure to keep it in our bag so that we're not accidentally leaving anything behind on the reef. Okay, so thanks again so much to Drew and Joe for getting this set up. Makes it go a lot faster. Now, we are going to need some tools for this outplanting. So I'm going to make sure to take out our data sheet here, the same data sheet that you students use for your total linear extension. And then I'm going to take this big brush here. Now I do want to say, first things first, that this is a outplant site that was allowed, that we at CCMI are allowed to outplant to on the natural reef from a permit from the Department of Environment. So it may look like this is harmful to the reef, but overall this is for the benefit of the reef. So I'm going to clean around these nails to make it free of any algae. This is that bad algae we were talking about that competes with the coral directly. And we just want to make sure that the area we're outplanting to is totally free from any algae or sponges or encrusting algae that may make it hard for that coral to grow into the structure. Now, after we've cleaned it really well, we're going to use a 2-part marine epoxy, just sort of like an underwater glue. It's 2 different colors, just barely. One is a little more gray than the other, one's a little bit creamy or white colored. And I'm just going to mix those up really, really well into what's called a homogeneous mixture. So homogeneous mixture means that you just can't tell the difference between the colors anymore. It all looks the same. Until it starts to give off this kind of smoky look. And then you know that the underwater glue is about ready to use. It starts to get a little more easier to mix together as well, a little more malleable, and it feels kind of like silly putty. I don't know if you guys actually still have silly putty or if that was totally a thing when I was a kid, but I think it might still be. Okay, so now you can see it's smoking pretty good to the point where you probably can't even see my face anymore. And you only need a little amount, maybe the size of a Hershey's Kiss. And I'm going to put it on the side of these nails. Just at the very, very base there. I've got a bit of extra that I can keep on the side, just in case. And then we're going to take a zip tie and we're we're going to zip tie this coral in place. So we squish the coral as best we can into that epoxy, and then wrap this zip tie. If we can get 2 on there, we'll try. Actually, we may only need 1 for this one. There we go. And you got to zip tie that coral in place on that nail as tightly as you can. You got to pull that zip tie really hard. Okay? Because you don't want that coral to be able to move around at all, because what's going to happen is the coral tissue is going to grow over that zip tie. So it's not going to harm the coral at all. The coral is going to think that this zip tie is now a part of its internal skeleton, and it's going to grow its tissue right over it as fast as maybe a week or 2 from now. Now this epoxy, you got to push up into those coral polyps on the bottom so that it gets deep inside the coral skeleton, and then again all around the base. Because same with the zip tie, the coral is going to think that this is part of its skeleton and grow over it fairly quickly. Alright, and the last step is you want to trim this zip tie. Because the more zip tie there is, the more algae is actually going to grow on it. There we go. All right. So that coral is now outplanted onto the reef, and we'll probably overgrow this zip tie and the nail and that epoxy on the bottom in maybe just a month or 2. So not very long at all. So let's go ahead and do this one next. All right. Got the epoxy set. There we go. Now, you students at home may be thinking, this doesn't actually look that hard, but today is a relatively calm day, and there's not a lot of wave action, and there's no current or surge down here, but on days when you're trying to outplant coral and there's a lot of wind or a lot of waves, this can actually be really hard. Especially because we're trying to help the reef, right? Not trying to hurt the reef. So you don't want to be accidentally hitting the bottom of the reef with your fins. And you want to make sure that you're outplanting the coral and it's nice and tight and not moving around a lot in the swells or waves, because that would totally defeat the purpose of trying to help the reef out here. Alright, so I'm just smoothing that coral out a bit more, and then we'll cut this one's tail. And there you go. We've got 2 brand new outplanted corals from our coral nursery here on the reef.
Katie, what a cool demonstration. I just want to check again. How is your air?
Let's see. I've got about 1,500 PSI, and it looks like my videographers are doing pretty good as well. So, actually, Ashley.
Yes.
My videographer Drew and I are doing pretty good, but my other videographer needed to go up and get another tank to come back down and meet us, so we're all good down here. We're just gonna wait for Lauren to come back down on the main camera, and now it's just Drew and I.
Okay, great. So I'm glad you guys, some of you are doing okay on air. I just want to take this time, I think it'd be a good time for some questions because we've had some really good ones coming in. Mandy wants to know, Mandy wants to know, why do they have to clean the corals so well, and how do corals get clean when there are no humans involved?
Oh, Mandy, that is a really good question. Honestly, the corals are just left to fend for themselves. So the whole reason that we have this nursery setting here is so that we humans can help the coral to actually do better than they would if left on their own naturally. So, of course, if they're on the reef like you see around me, there's really nobody to clean them, and they just naturally compete with that algae. And unfortunately, it's a pretty tough environment to live in. It's a beautiful place, but it's very competitive. And if you remember us talking back to the Complex World of Coral Reefs one, you may remember how we talked about the constant battle for space and resources on the reef, and that's what these corals are having to go through unless we're here to help take care of them like an underwater coral garden.
Thank you so much for that, Katie.
Yeah.
So it looks like we're kind of coming to the end of our lesson here, and I gotta tell you, you've done such a great job. The whole team has. This has been so interesting to learn how all of this is happening. One more question from at least myself, and maybe we'll get to some more students too. I want to know, can only scientists get involved in the coral nursery process?
That's a great question, Ashley. And honestly, I want to say that it's not just us scientists that can do this. We actually at CCMI get sometimes hundreds of visiting researchers, students, and citizen scientists each year coming to CCMI to help visit our coral nursery. They come to us, we teach them about this coral species, we teach them how to clean them, and we teach them how to outplant them. So it's not just scientists that can do it. Anybody who is a trained volunteer or a trained scuba diver can also do this.
That is very cool, and I gotta tell you, I wish I had known about coral nurseries like this when I was growing up.
Me too.
So, do you think you have some time for a few more questions?
I'm at about 1200 PSI, and so is my videographer Drew, so yeah, we got time for a couple more.
Okay, let's get one more question down, and then I think we're gonna be able to wrap this up, and it's gonna be a great time.
All right.
So, one of the questions was, when it's a rough day, do strong waves harm the coral?
Good question. On a rough day, occasionally rough waves will hurt this coral. But that is one of the ways that this coral naturally reproduces, is through asexual reproduction. And asexual reproduction is the fragmenting technique that we are mimicking as scientists to create coral nurseries. So the wave may come along and hit this coral really, really hard and cause it to jump around like this, and it may break some of the branches off, but then hopefully those branches will roll around the reef until they find a good spot to solidify themselves and start growing and reestablishing themselves in that spot as well. Unfortunately, there are also times where really big storms will take one of these boulder corals behind me and overturn an entire boulder coral. And then it's really hard for that big boulder to right itself again. So sometimes it's a good thing, and sometimes it's not such a good thing.
So Katie, I'm wondering, after you've been saying all of this, is it possible that we'd ever be able to see corals the way that they were back in the before the 1970s to 2000s when there was that massive die-off?
That's a great question. And although we scientists are going through this massive effort for growing all this coral in nurseries, really, we know that we're never going to get to the point that we used to be at before the 1970s. It's just not possible. Unless we get the help of you students at home and in class, for all of us to do our part as good ocean stewards and help to continue preserving our environment. If you students remember back to our first lesson on the complex world of coral reefs, we talked about the threats that coral reefs today are facing, and that included things like single-use plastics and pollution in the ocean. You remember I pulled out a plastic bag and it moved kind of like a jellyfish across the reef? If we can prevent pollution from going in the seas, or if we can minimize our carbon footprint by turning the lights off when you leave a room, or walking to school instead of riding or driving, or just choosing to say no thank you to those single-use water bottles, you students are making the difference and choosing to be a good ocean steward. Now, what we scientists can do to help as well is that we can try to grow these corals in a nursery. Once they're big enough, we'll outplant them all around the island and hopefully Caribbean-wide. And what we'll do is not try to grow as much tissue to make the reefs look like they used to do, but we will try to connect the already existing natural populations with one another. Now, how we do this is there's this really beautiful, very rare, once-a-year event called Massive Spawning Event of the staghorn coral and its very close relative, the elkhorn coral. And what happens during this incredible time is once a year, these corals will reproduce sexually as well. And what they'll do is they'll release these bundles that contain both sperm cells and egg cells, and they'll release them into the water column all at the same time, all across the Cayman Islands, all across the Caribbean Sea, all at once into the water column. And the hope is that they'll intermix and they'll cross-fertilize and they'll create new little baby corals that will eventually settle onto the reef and become beautiful, perfect, small, little, brand new staghorn corals. So we scientists know that we're not going to outplant enough tissue and enough total linear extension onto the reef to make it look like it did before the 1970s, but our hope is that we can outplant enough of these corals onto the reef to help the corals to help themselves for the future, and we can't do that without the help of you guys doing what you can for our oceans as well.
Katie, I gotta tell you, I think that sounds like such an incredible event, and I hope that all of us, especially you students out there, can one day see what it's like during a coral spawning event. I do think it's time for you to say goodbye to the students today, so Katie, if you can wave goodbye to everybody, we're gonna wrap this up here. Thank you so much.
All right, Ashley. Well, I just want to say thanks again to you students for joining us down here for our third Reefs Go Live. It's been an awesome dive, and we have another one coming up next week on March 13th called Lionfish, the Perfect Invader, and I won't be your dive buddy that time, but I'm sure that you'll be in for an awesome dive. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
All right, so now for you students, as Katie mentioned, I hope that you learned some valuable lessons today. I know I did. I learned what a coral is, how important it is to have coral nurseries, and most importantly, what we all can do to help these corals survive so that we have them in the future. I hope you followed along and worked on your in-class activity sheet. You guys had a lot of great questions today, so if we didn't get to it, what we're going to do when we log off is we will have Katie answer all of those questions, and we'll be able to send them to you so you can discuss them in class. Thank you so much from everyone here at our Reefs Go Live team, And don't forget to tune in next week, March 13th, for Lionfish the Perfect Invader. From everyone here, thank you. See you next time.